Okay, Rabbi, say we're on Daf Samach Gimel Amid Aleph, and if you recall, we were analyzing a statement of Rava that would shed a light on the Shita of Rebby Meir, the Acherim, regarding the difference between the following two scenarios. One is where he had a machshava l'shem mulim u'l'shem arelim. So his first machshava was the right one, l'shem mulim, and then he had a machshava l'shem arelim u'l'shem mulim. And here's where the acherim differentiate. In the first case, the carbon Pesach is kosher because he started on the right foot. In the second case, the carbon is possible. And Rava identified Rebby Meir with the shita ein l'shchita el basof. And on Yom Chamishi, we had a long discussion. Let's just review the highlights. That if you hold ein l'shchita el basof, both machshavos, l'shem arelim and l'shem mulim, are vying for that second in time, that one indivisible moment of time of sof shchita. And therefore, Rava says that in this case, there are two machshavos that are mutually exclusive, and Rebby Meir is going to apply the principle called tfos lashon rishon. What says Rava? You have to be very, very careful. This is not tfos lashon rishon of chazara, which means that, he said X and then he said non-X and he changed his mind, and therefore he doesn't have the right to change his mind. But rather, says Rava, this is halacha in seder, which means that as far as his machshav is concerned, he had both machshavos in mind. And if these two machshavos are mutually exclusive, because once the first machshava generates its impact, its chalos, there's no room for the second machshava. That's exactly the shita of Rebby Meir, the Acherim, that we're going to take the first machshava, which already registers, so to speak, and once it's chal, the second machshava cannot undermine the first machshava. It has nothing to do with chazara, says Rava. And it has to do with the fact that you have two machshavas and you want both of them, and they are mutually exclusive. Now, why are these two machshavas mutually exclusive? Because of ein l'shchita el basof. If you hold yesh l'shchita mitchila v'atsof, then you could talk about reconciling the two machshavos. And in fact, if you reject Rebby Meir, you could hold gam al sof dvarav, al gmar dvarav, adam nitfas, that we count and we register both machshavos. Now, where, in what context did Rava present this analysis of the shita of Rebby Meir ve'acher? It was the case in Tmura. And he said, Arezu Tmuras Ola, Arezu Tmuras Shlomim. He looks at a behema and he says it should be a Tmura of an Ola, it should be a Tmura of a Shlomim. It can't be both. It's got to be one or the other. These are two statements that are mutually exclusive. And the Acherim Rebby Meir say, Tfos Lashon Rishon, and it becomes a Tmuras Ola and not a Tmuras Shlomim. Then the sugya presents another scenario where he says chetzia tmuras ola v'chetzia shlomim. Now the difference between the two cases is very fundamental. In the first case of arezu tmuras ola tmuras shlomim, you could argue that Rebby Meir's halacha that it's tmuras ola not tmuras shlomim is based on the chazara of tfos lashon rishon, meaning that he is changing his mind because clearly you cannot have both. It can't be both tmuras ola and tmuras shlomim. So when he adds Harezu Tmur Shlomim, he now is rejecting his original position of Harezu Tmur Ola, and Rebby Meir activates the principle of Tfos Lashon Rishon, meaning we believe that he's changing his mind, but his original mindset was Tmuras Ola. That's what's going to be Chal. Says Rava, no, that's wrong. That's not what Rebby Meir is saying. He's not talking about Chazara, and I'll prove it to you. Because in the case where he says Chetzia Ola v'Chetzia Shlomim, Rebby Meir still insists on Tfos Lashon Rishon. The carbon will be an Ola and not a Shlomim, meaning the Danza carbon is an Ola, even though it's clear that he, in his mind, was reconciling both of these machshavos, and he was not interested in Chazara. From the get-go, he wanted half the animal to be Ola and the other half to be Shlomim. But that's not going to happen. It's going to be Ola and not Shlomim. Why? Because Rebby Meir, again, whenever I say Rebby Meir Chachamim, that's interchangeable. The principle of Rebby Meir, of Tfos Lashon Rishon, is based on two chalosim, b'zechar zeh, that are mutually exclusive. And Rebby Meir's Tfos Lashon Rishon means that once he enunciates the first statement, the first declaration, that generates a chalos, and that chalos is chal, period. It's engraved in stone. And here we have a halacha of his pashtus kedusha bekula, meaning whatever kedusha is chal on part of the animal spreads to include the entire animal. And once Tfos Lashon Rishon, he said Chetzia Ola, that half of the animal became Ola, and then the mechanics is that the Kedushas Ola spreads throughout the entire animal. Every last molecule and every last capillary and blood vessel in the animal is an extension of the original Kedusha, in this case, Kedushas Ola. Now, in this context, Rava adds the following main point, that Rebby Meir accepts the position that ein l'shchita el b'sof. And that's what the Gemara says over here on the top of Daf Samach Gimel Amud Aleph, Lema de kasavri acherim, eino l'shchita el b'sof, ukida Rava, Yomar Rava adayin hi machlokas. That Rava said that adayin, meaning don't limit the machlokas to the case of harezu tmuras ola tmuras shlomim. That's not the only argument between Rebby Meir and his dissenters, which in this case is Rabbi Yossi, and applies Tfos Lashon Rishon, which you could interpret as Chazara, because how can it be both Ola and Shlom? It must be that he changed his mind. Nain, says Rava, the Shita of Rebby Meir applies even in the case of Behema Chetzia Tmuras Ola v'Chetzia Tmuras Shlomim. Even though his original kavanah was for both Kedushos, or Raya, he wanted half the Behema to be that, and half Ola, half Shlomim. Nevertheless, Rebby Meir is going to insist Tfos Lashon Rishon, and the animals in Ola, period. Even though we don't apply the Tfos Lashon Rishon of Chazara, because, as we said before, he's not interested in Chazara and rescinding his original position. From the get-go, he wanted the animal to be split between Ola and Shlomim. Nevertheless, the very moment he says Chetzia Ola, we apply the mechanics of Mispashtus Kedusha Bekula, the entire animal becomes an Ola. And in Seder Advarim, it's the sequence that will determine, because the first in the sequence, once it's Chal, you cannot undermine that. Even if his intention was to do it that way, meaning that half should be an Ola and half should be shlom. Rava then goes ahead and says that Rebby Meir is predicated on his shita, meaning Rebby Meir's shita, that eino l'shchita el lebasof. So how does eino l'shchita el lebasof kick in here in Rava's understanding of the shita Rebby Meir? That's what we were up to when we said Shavua Tov last week. So now we're going to introduce a sugya, not in Tmura, which we already covered, but rather in Zvachim on Daf Chav Tes Amid Beis. The Gemara records a machlokes between Rabbi Yehuda and Chachamim in the following scenario. He had a machsheves pigul. For example, he had in mind that the zrika would be chutzes mano, the achila would be chutzes mano, and that's called a machshava hamefageles. And he had in mind that he would either eat or be zorek chutz l'mekomo, and now he has in mind two different machshavos. So what's the problem? We said that pigul is only chal if there could have been ritzu. And if he has a machshava of pigul, let's say chutzes mano in one of the avodos, in the other three avodos, he had in mind lizmano. But if he has in mind chutz, let's say shalom bizmano in shchita, and then he has in mind chutz l'mkomo, for example, in zrika, then there's no pigul. Meaning, if you eat the meat, you're not chayv kares. Why is it? Because even though he had a machshava fageles in zrika, in shchita, but he had likewise a psul, a machshava poseles in zrika, because he had in mind the zrika of chutz l'mkom, that the basa should be eaten outside of the azar. Okay. So all that is universally accepted. Less mandapol. What's the machlokus between Rabbi Yehuda and Chachamim? B'shash chita, he had in mind to divvy up the basa or the carbon into two segments. He would eat part of the carbon chutz limkomo, and part of the carbon chutz lizmano. Let's say he had in mind at the shchita that one kazayas of basa would be eaten outside the azara, and another kazayas of basar would be eaten tomorrow or the day after in the case of shlom. Chutz lizmano. So he had both chutz lizmano and chutz limkomo in mind, and his first machshava, sequentially, was chutz limkomo. The Chachamim say it's not pigul. Why? Because we cannot establish the carbon as having a ritzui, as lending itself to ritzui. In this case, we have two machshavos. According to Chacham, since he has both a machshava of chutz lizmano, which is a machshavas pigul, and then he has another machshava of chutz limkomo, And the Torah says lo yirotze, which means that pigul is only chal if there was no other psul in the carbon. It was perfectly kimitzvaso, except for that one single machshava haposeles. Comes along Rabbi Yehuda, and he says it depends which machshava he had first. And again, when we say machshava, let's assume it means dibur, just to make life easier. That itself is an issue. If he declared first the machshavas hazman, which is machshava hamafageles, that I will eat the kazayas of this carbon tomorrow, and then subsequently he had a machshava they will eat a kazayas outside the azara. Says Rabbi Yehuda, the carbon is possible. Not only possible, it's pigul. And if you eat it, you're chayav for kazayas pigul kares. Why is that so? So Rava says because Rabbi Yehuda accepts Rebby Meir's shita of tfos lashon rishon, where the chachamim in this case would say it's not pigul because of the principle of Rabbi Yossi that af bigmar dvarav adam nitfas, and we accept both machshavos. If we accept and we register both machshavos, then we don't have a fulfillment of lo yirotze, meaning that we need that the entire carbon was done kimitzvaso, because vis-a-vis one kazayas, he had the additional machshava of chutzim koma. Again, we're talking about his machshava b'shach shchita. Rabbi Yehuda holds, says Rava, tfos lashon rishon, and therefore only the machsheves zman is chal, which means that's the only machshava, negative machshava that registers on the Richter scale, and hence it generates pigul in the bosom. Says Rava, we cannot apply tfos lashon rishon for Rabbi Yehuda if it means chazara, because at the shchita, at that moment, he had both machshavos. He had in mind that there would be a kazayis chutzim zmano, and he had in mind that another kazayis would be chutzim koma. This is exactly parallel to the case of harezu chetzio tmuras ola, the chetzio tmuras shlamim, where from the get-go he had in mind both ola and shlamim. And here also, from the get-go, at the moment of shchita, he had in mind both chutzim zmano and chutzim koma. Chachamim therefore undermine pigul. It cannot be pigul because pigul only applies when the machshava fagelis is the only machshava of psul. Here he had two machshavas of psul. Rabbi Yehuda says it's pigul, and Rava says because tfos lashon rishon, his first machshava is the only one that registers, and that was the machshava of kizayis chutzim zmano. Hence it's pigul. This is not chazorah. He's not changing his mind. He's not trying to rescind what he said before. Yeah, let a kazayis in this bossa be chutzim zmano. I want to add nachtetzi, another problem. I want a kazayis bossa chutzim koma. How does Rabbi Yehuda apply tfos lashon rishon and establish that the carbon is pigul? The answer is that even though he's not choser, because again the animal has many different kazesim, but rather Rabbi Yehuda holds that the first machshava and only the first machshava is chal, and that's because he accepts the sheet of tfos lashon rishon of Rebby Meir that goes with the Seder Advar, meaning the chalos, in a case where there's a contradiction, is going to be a chalos keseder hotzas mipiv. So immediately when he declares that he's going to eat a kazayis bosa chutzim zmano, at that moment the carbon becomes pigul. And now the second machshava, which is chutzlim komo, which is coming to undermine pigul, in that paradoxical halacha, cannot be chal because the first machshava, the first dibur was already chal, and it generated the shem pigul. I mean, you and I might have said, "What do you mean it generates the shem pigul? Let's wait to see what happens, in the next avoda." But what we're saying is that if the second avoda is coming to undermine the first avoda, in this case from the perspective of pigul, then the halacha of Rabbi Yehuda and Rebby Meir kicks in of tfos lashon rishon. That if the second dibur, his second declaration, is coming to undermine the chalos of the first dibur, then the first dibur is already chal, and there's no room for the second dibur to register and undermine the first dibur. That's tfos lashon rishon. Now, the Chachamim, on the other hand, they're going to say the following, that Yeshno l'shchita mitchila ve'ad sof. That means that every moment of the shchita, every part and particle of the shchita is what generates the shchita. And if he had in mind kezayis chutzim zmano and kezayis chutzim komo, then both are machshavas of shchita, because bigmar dvarav adam af bigmar dvarim adam nitpas. So we're going to register both of these machshavos, and that's how we undermine the chalos pigul. Masha Enken, according to Rava in Rabbi Yehuda and Rebby Meir, that ein l'shchita ela basof. So what's going to happen is that there are two machshavos that are battling each other for that one moment when the shchita is chal at the end of the shchita. And here we're going to apply the mitzvah, tfos lashon rishon, that the very second that he declares that the shchita is for a kezayis basa to be eaten chutz l'zmano, at that moment, the psul of pigul is going to be chal. I know Yechiel, you want to say something here. Just give me, if you can, just 5 more minutes, because I want to get the whole picture. In other words, it's going to confuse me. Again, this is a very, we're obviously combining many different sugyas. So let's just try to get the whole picture. Now, again, we're back to the Gemara in Zvachim, and the Gemara quotes Abai. Abai says the following: are you of the opinion, Rava, that ein l'shchita ela basof, which means that yesh kan machshava achas bilvad she'osa choshav b'sof hashchita al shnei zeisen? In other words, your opinion, Rava, is that there's no chazorah here. Why? Because he wants both machshavas to be chal simultaneously at the end of the shchita. And if that's his machshava, there's no chazorah over here. He wants both. And in his mind, he can certainly have both, because one kezayis is going to be eaten chutzim mano and another chutzim komo. Meaning, again, we're going to concentrate, so to speak, reduce or condense all his machshavos into one moment, and that's at the end of the shechita. So there's no chazorah over here, and therefore tfos lashon rishon takes on a new meaning, namely that the first machshava is going to be chal, And the second machshava cannot undermine the first machshava, therefore the carbon is possible. It's pigul. And therefore we're going to jump to the conclusion that Rebby Meir, in the case of chetzia ola, right, tmuras ol chetzia tmuras shlamim, is ola. Because there's no chazara. But it's the first one is going to be chal. Says Abaye Nen, Yeshna l'shchita mitchila vad sof. The shchita already registers from the beginning. Let's call it the first simon. When he cuts the first simon, he hasn't gotten to the second simon. There's already a shchita. And therefore, says Abaye, when he shechs the first simon, he had in mind to eat the kizayis chutzuz mano. When he gets to the second simon, which is again a progressional chalosh shchita, he's at the second simon. He has in mind to eat a kizayis basar chutz limkoma. If that be the case, says Abaye, then the logic here of Rebby Meir and Rabbi Yehuda to establish pigul is not because of tfos lashon rishon, but rather he says, this is the part that I'm a little unsure about, so give me a little chizuk here. He says, Yesh kan shtei machshavos b'shnei zmanim, achas b'tchilas hashchita. This is all Abaye, right? V'achas b'sofa. Hilkoch miyad sheshachad es hasiman harishon al das lechol kizayis echad. Miyad sheshachad es hasiman harishon al das lechol kizayis lemochar. Not sure where he says lemochar. Oh yeah, lemochar. Okay, that's good. Chutzuz mano is chal shem pigul. The ein machshavto ashniya b'simon ashniya motzi oso midei kach. So I'm going to take a stab at this. I may be proven wrong, but my theory is that Abaye wants to justify the ruling of Rabbi Yehuda / Rebby Meir of pigul, even if I hold yeshna l'shchita mitchila ve'ad sof. How so? That he has in mind two machshavos. One is at the beginning of the shchita, and a second one at the end of the shchita. And the first simon at the beginning of shchita, he has in mind to eat a kazayis basal of machar. And now we're going to say that itself generates pigul. Now he comes along with the second machshava, and he wants to eat a kazayis basar at the time of simon of shchita simon sheni chutzlim komo. Is ein machshavto ashniya b'simon shniya motzi also midei kach. In other words, according to Abaye, you have no proof as to what Rebby Meir would hold in the case of chetzia ola chetzia shlamim. Why? Because we can understand Rebby Meir and Rabbi Yehuda in a whole different way. we don't have to introduce the halach of Tfos Lashon Rishon. See, Rava was insisting that the Shita Rabbi Yehuda could only be understood in light of Rebby Meir's Tfos Lashon Rishon, because Rav understood that we're talking about Tfos Lashon Rishon. I'm sorry, let's start again. Rav understood that we're talking about Ein L'Shchita El Basof. And if Ein L'Shchita El Basof, and he wants both of these machshavos to be chal simultaneously at the end of the Shchita, then insofar as the one machshava is a machshava fagelis and the other is not, then even though he had in mind that both machshavas would be chal at the end of the shchita, such that there's no application of chazara, nevertheless, Rabbi Yehuda and Rebby Meir hold Tfos Lashon Rishon, and the machshava fagelis will be chal, and we will view and define his second machshava as a chazara. But that's impossible because we're holding Ein L'Shchita El Basof. So if Ein L'Shchita El Basof, it's not a chazara. He wants both machshavos on two different kisesim to be chal simultaneously. Then we must assume that Rabbi Meir's Tfos Lashon Rishon means kiseder, that once the first machshava is chal, the second machshava is not empowered to undermine the first machshava and change the chalos. Says Abai, no. There's a whole other way of understanding Rabbi Yehuda. Why is this carbon pigul? Why is the boss of pigul? Not because of Tfos Lashon Rishon, but for a different reason. That the first simon itself generates pigul. In other words, the very, shall we say, split second, fraction of a second that he had the machshava at the time of Simon Rishon, of Kazais Basel Chutzim Komo, Chutzim Mano, at that moment the carbon itself became pigul. Li'olam, it could be possible that if a man wanted two machshavas to be chal, and there was no chazara, then both machshavas could be chal. But in this case of shchita, here we're saying yesh l'shchita v'tchila v'ad sof, and we can divvy up the shchita into separate segments, such that each simon is independent of the other simon as far as shchita is concerned. So the first simon also generates the shchita and the heter shchita. If that be the case, then the animal is already pigul. The very moment he shechs the first simon, almanas lechol kizayis min abosar chutz lizmano, the carbon itself becomes pigul, which in the language of the Gemara is called yesh pigul lechatzi matir, and that's based on yesh l'shchita mitchila v'yad sof. So Abai says that if we introduce yesh l'shchita mitchila v'yad sof into the framework of Rabbi Yehuda, Rebby Meir, and we understand very well why the carbon is pigul, even if Tfos Lashon Rishon would not apply in this case, because he had in mind both a Kazayas Chutzim Zmano and a Kazayas Chutzim Komo. Again, we haven't really studied the Chachamim yet. Let me just. Oh, so now Rava says to Abaye, that no, we're going to prove from Rabbi Yehuda what Rabbi Yehuda and therefore Rebby Meir would hold in Chetzia Ola Chetzia Shlomim, because Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Yehuda hold Ein L'Shchita El Basof, and the machshavos cannot generate a chalos until the end of the shchita. And therefore, Rabbi Yehuda says that even though he has two machshavos at the same time, and theoretically we could reconcile them and split up the basar, one kazayis here, one kazayis there, But nevertheless, we're going to apply the principle of tfos lashon rishon. And tfos lashon rishon means not chazara, but the first machshava doesn't allow the second machshava to be chal. And one last point here, the Chachamim hold that yeshna l'shchita mitchila ve'ad sof, and therefore both machshavas could be chal. And the nafkamina, let's say, get back to our sugya, is we had a machshavas harelim and also machshavas mulim. So since the Chachamim hold yeshna l'shchita mitchila ve'ad sof, therefore part of the shchita could be for the sake of harelim, and part of the shchita for the sake of mulim. And therefore, it doesn't matter one iota whether he started with a machshava of harelim and then went on to mulim, or vice versa. In any case, it's always going to be mixas orla. Masha enken, according to the acherim, according to Rebby Meir, well, the ein l'shchita ela basof, and therefore, if he starts with a machshava l'shem harelim, then that machshava l'shem harelim is chal immediately, because it's the first of two lashonos, and then the machshava of lemulim, which comes to undermine and contradict the first machshava l'shem harelim, could not be chal, and therefore the machshava l'shem harelim is the only machshava to be chal, and therefore the korban is possible. Okay, that's what I have so far. Yechiel? I don't know if you.
I didn't have any question. I'm good. Thank you.
Oh, okay. All right. I see it's getting late. So let's just make a note of where we got up to here. And we're going to start with Omar Rava. That's where we're going to start in Mirz Hashem tomorrow. Okay, then? So I wish everyone. Let's just add a few notes over here towards the end of the shir. Number one, the makar, the source for his pashtus kedusha that we said in the case of chetzia, his pashtus kedusha in the case of chetzia ola is derived in the Gemara in Tmura on Daf Yud Aleph in the case of a person who declares Ragla Shalzu Ola. And there's a machlokas tanoim with the regel itself, and only the regel becomes kedosha, or there's a chalos his pashtus kedusha on the entire animal. And that's a case of Aver she'enan neshama tluyaba. But if he's makdish and Aver neshama tluyaba, everybody agrees that his pashtus kedusha, and certainly in the case of a person is makdish half the animal, that includes neshama tluyaba. Now, getting back to Abaye in the sugya in Zvachim, Abaye disagrees with Rava, and he claims that Rebby Meir would be moda in a case of someone who declares chetzia tmuras ola v'chetzia tmuras shlamim, that the kedusha is chal of both the kedusha of ola and the kedusha shlamim are chal simultaneously. And then we have yirat sheyistayev, because the reasoning of Rebby Meir in tmuras ola and tmuras shlamim is chazara, and that makes sense in the case of tmuras ola and tmuras shlamim, where you cannot even theoretically have both. But if he says chetzia tmuras ola, chetzia shvuas shlamim, that's not chazara. That's clear that he had in mind that he wanted both, and therefore the animal becomes both tmuras ola and tmuras shlamim, and therefore tira'ad shetipol bo mum. And Rava is going to be next online. We'll see in Mirz Hashem tomorrow his presentation, and he may come up with another possible explanation of the acherim other than Rava. But Rava's explanation is that we're talking about ein l'shchita ela libasa. So that's where we'll We'll pick it up tomorrow. Thank you so much.